Last session, we closed with a shift in mental map, from isolated departments and static frameworks toward a living network of critical boundaries, each powered by a continuous learning loop. We named 7 minimum viable capabilities as the operational engine that makes that loop run. This session goes inside those 7 capabilities. We'll look at what each one actually does, why removing any of them creates a predictable failure mode, and how the full set works as a system rather than a checklist. We'll also look at a diagnostic, 7 questions you can ask about any specific boundary right now to find out where the gaps are. Let's start with what makes a system trustable in the first place. A trustable system is not one that looks clean on a dashboard. It's one that can be diagnosed, one whose behavior under pressure is visible, traceable, and improvable. The word trustable matters here. Trust in a system isn't built by asserting that it's safe. It's built by demonstrating, over time and under real conditions, that it behaves as claimed. That demonstration requires evidence. And evidence requires a specific set of operational capabilities to generate, surface, and act on it. The 7 minimum viable capabilities are the anatomy of that trustable system. Together they answer a question no framework catalog can answer on its own. Not whether controls exist, but whether the organization can reliably detect, respond to, and learn from what happens at its most critical boundaries. Below this baseline of trustable operation, no amount of dashboard monitoring will catch surprises in time. Above it, governance becomes genuinely useful, grounded in what the system actually does rather than what it was designed to do. The word minimum in minimum viable capabilities is important and easily misread. It doesn't mean a lower standard. It means a floor, the baseline below which a system cannot be trusted to govern itself, regardless of how mature its paperwork looks. Think of it structurally. Above a certain threshold, a boundary is supported. Its behavior under pressure is detectable, manageable, and improvable. Below that threshold, the system falls into a zone of undetected drift and systemic fragility. Green dashboards can still exist there. Audit findings can still be closed. Framework mappings can still be updated. But surprises will keep arriving because the mechanisms that would catch and correct drift are absent. A capability model is often mistaken for a description of perfection. These 7 are not aspirational ideals. They are the functional minimum required to run a living system. Organizations that operate below this baseline are, in effect, governing by hope, assuming that because things have held so far, they will continue to hold. That assumption fails at the worst possible moments. The question is never whether to have all 7. The question is how well each one is actually working at the boundaries that matter most. Picture the 7 capabilities arranged around a central operational boundary, grouped by the role each plays. The directional core, govern and assure, defines reality and then tests whether the definition holds. These 2 are inseparable. Govern without assure produces well-intentioned policies that drift from practice. Assure without govern produces evidence that no one is authorized to act on. The preparation engine, plan and design, links constraints to usable patterns. Plan connects intent to the real capacity and timing limitations of the boundary. Design turns that planning into concrete runbooks and patterns that people can actually follow under pressure. The action engine, change and execute, moves intent into reality safely. Change controls how new things land at the boundary without overwhelming it. Execute is where everything else proves itself, the human layer where upstream preparation either works or doesn't. The evolution space, innovate, is the deliberate room the system keeps for adaptation. Without it, all change becomes either firefighting or transformation, with nothing in between. Every value stream, platform, and boundary touches all 7. When one is missing or weak, the boundary warps, behaving in ways that appear fine until a specific kind of pressure reveals the gap. One of the most useful things the 7 capabilities provide is a way to distinguish between governance that works and governance that merely looks like it works. Compliance theater is what happens when activities that were originally designed to produce real assurance get reduced to their visible forms, the documentation, the meeting, the sign-off, without the underlying substance. Consider 4 capabilities and what theater looks like versus what testable capability looks like. For govern, Theater is a calendar invite and a committee. Testable capability means clear, named decisions that are explicitly linked to drift and to specific outcomes at the boundary. For Assure, theater is sampling policies and documentation, reviewing what was written rather than observing what happened. Testable capability means sampling actual behavior in live system runs. For Design, theater is an aspirational presentation slide, a diagram of how the system should work. Testable capability means runbooks that engineers actually trust and reach for at 2 in the morning when something is wrong. For Change, theater is an approval pipeline to navigate, a sequence of boxes to check before a change is permitted. Testable capability means a governed blast radius and sequence capacity, understanding exactly how much disruption a change can cause and staging it accordingly. The diagnostic question that cuts through all of it: are you generating evidence that your controls deliver outcomes, or merely evidence that they exist? Govern and Assure work as a pair. Neither functions properly without the other. Govern is the capability of deciding what good looks like in public with names attached, in a way that the rest of the system can orient toward. It answers 3 questions at any important boundary. What outcomes are genuinely non-negotiable? Who holds the authority to accept risk when a trade-off is required? And what happens specifically when reality departs from intent? That last question is the one most governance structures avoid. But it's the one that determines whether governance is real or symbolic. If there's no defined response to drift, governance has no consequence, and over time the organization learns that. Assure is the capability of testing whether the story holds up. At Meridian's settlement boundary, that means regular sampling of actual settlement runs, not reviewing documentation about how they should work, but observing how they do work. It means post-incident examination of whether the safeguards that were supposed to activate actually did. And critically, it means that when gaps are found, Assure must trigger adjustments in Govern, Design, or Change. If evidence of a gap produces nothing more than a closed ticket, Assure has failed its primary function, which is forcing learning, not merely recording observation. Here's a case that shows exactly what happens when the Assure loop breaks down at the human layer. On a submarine preparing for a nighttime operation, rigging for what crews call rig for black, reducing all light to protect night vision. A standard safety procedure called tagout requires every power switch in a circuit to be tagged, verified, and signed off before the circuit can be considered isolated. In this instance, a switch was missed during the tagging step. The verification step didn't catch it. The officer signed off anyway. The result was a blinding electrical discharge in the control room at exactly the moment when the crew's night vision was most critical. The design was correct. The assurance loop tag verify sign-off was the right structure. But human behavior undermined it at 2 of the 3 steps. This is the failure mode the Assure capability is specifically designed to prevent, and the reason why Assure cannot be satisfied by documentation alone. The design said the loop would run. The execution said it didn't. The assurance step that should have caught that gap was also skipped. Layered systems collapse when human behavior undermines the design. Controls are only as reliable as the behaviors carrying them out, which is why Assure must sample actual behavior, not just verify that procedures exist. Plan and design are where intent gets translated into something the boundary can actually use. Plan's job is to connect intent to risk, not to delivery pressure. This is a harder discipline than it sounds. In most organizations, timing decisions are driven by deadlines. When does the product ship? When does the quarter close? When did we promise the client? Fragility data, what the system can actually absorb safely, where the stress points are, what the consequence of introducing a change during a high load period would be, tends to be secondary or absent entirely. Effective planning anchors timing in that fragility data. It makes trade-offs explicit before anyone attempts a change at the boundary. Not we'll see what happens, but here is what we know about this boundary's capacity. Here is what this change will cost it. And here is our explicit decision about whether to proceed. Design translates that planning into concrete runbooks and failover patterns, the actual artifacts that people use under pressure. There's a critical quality test for any design artifact. Can it be trusted by an engineer at 2 in the morning? under stress with incomplete information? If the answer is no, if it requires calm conditions or specialized knowledge to interpret, it isn't really a design artifact. It's a diagram. And design must update dynamically. When an incident review reveals that a pattern failed, the pattern changes. Design is not a one-time output. It is a living repository that reflects what has actually been learned. Change and execute are where everything designed and planned either works or doesn't. Change is the capability of moving on purpose. It requires two disciplines that most change processes lack. First, the impact on outcomes must be made explicit before the change lands, not assessed afterward, not assumed to be manageable, but stated clearly as part of the proposal. Second, changes must be sequenced to match the system's actual absorption capacity. A boundary that is already under stress cannot absorb the same volume of change as one operating well below its limits. The deployment wave diagram makes this concrete. Change is staged across waves, with capacity monitored at each stage, so the system has time to stabilize before the next wave arrives. This is not bureaucracy. It is the difference between a controlled experiment and an uncontrolled one. Execute is the human layer where the upstream work proves itself or fails to. Three qualities define effective execution. Operators must be able to recognize trouble early, when there is still time to respond, rather than after the cascade has started. They must be able to surface that trouble safely, without fear that raising a concern will be treated as a performance failure. And the system must maintain enough operational slack that a single-point failure doesn't immediately cascade into a boundary-wide event. When execute works, the operational telemetry it generates, the incidents, near misses, and anomalies it surfaces, becomes the raw material that feeds assure, govern, and design. When execute is treated as pure delivery with no learning function, that material is lost. A well-documented example from 2024 shows what happens when change operates without adequate blast radius controls. A security software vendor pushed a faulty update through a privileged update channel, one that, by design, bypassed normal staged rollout controls. The update was intended to protect the systems that received it. Instead, it triggered widespread critical infrastructure failures across thousands of organizations simultaneously. The diagnostic is precise. This was a change propagation failure on two levels. The vendor deployed through a privileged channel without the staged rollout controls that would have caught the problem before full propagation. But the customers who deployed that tool also bear accountability, because they granted privileged, unsanctioned access to a tool at scale without verifying that their own blast radius controls would apply to updates from that channel. Compare the two blast radius diagrams. A governed staged rollout contains the impact to the area directly changed, allowing detection and rollback before the problem spreads. A systemic cascade where a privileged update propagates unchecked, shatters containment entirely. The lesson isn't about vendor trust. It's about blast radius governance. Every organization that grants privileged access to an external system inherits responsibility for what that access can do. Change capability requires knowing before a change lands exactly how far it can spread if it fails, and having the controls in place to limit that spread. The outcome measure structure, connecting a specific quality outcome to its quality measures, makes change accountability concrete rather than abstract. The CrowdStrike case provides a useful example of how this works in practice. The shared outcome at the boundary is stated clearly. Privileged security updates are deployed with verified blast radius controls and rollback capability. That's the root node. Everything else hangs from it. From the implementer's branch, two practical questions emerge. Were canary success thresholds met before the update propagated further? Was staged rollout adherence actually verified, not just required? From the auditor's branch, two different questions. Is there evidence that rollback capability was tested, not just documented as existing but actually exercised? And how quickly did vendor and customer incident response align when the failure occurred? Notice that both branches serve the same outcome. The implementer's questions are about whether the controls worked as designed. The auditor's questions are about whether the evidence of that working is real and independently verifiable. Measuring the controls individually is useless without evidence that they work together to govern the blast radius. This structure makes accountability visible without making it punitive. When an incident occurs, the outcome measure tree shows exactly which questions weren't answered in time and where in the capability system the gap originated. Innovate is the seventh capability, and the one most easily confused with something else. It isn't creativity for its own sake, and it isn't a transformation program. It's the deliberate space an organization maintains for adaptation, for changing how it protects value and delivers outcomes, not just what it delivers. 3 components define a healthy Innovate capability. First, space for adaptation. The organization actively experiments with new ways of operating, with explicit pathways for successful experiments to enter the main system and for failures to be cleanly retired. This requires a sandbox, an isolation layer where new approaches can be tested without risking the main operational flow. Second, safe experimentation. New reconciliation patterns or handoff protocols get tested during low-volume periods, in a separate test flow, before being introduced to the main operational current. Low-volume testing with real conditions, not idealized simulations. Third, and often missing entirely, the discipline of subtraction. Actively retiring controls or processes that no longer earn their place against current risks. Governance accumulates over time. Controls added during a past threat environment persist long after that environment has changed. If every control added is kept permanently, the system becomes heavier and more brittle over time, not more capable. If all change in an organization is either firefighting or massive transformation, Innovate is absent. The signal is in the middle. When there is no routine, low-stakes experimentation happening, the organization has lost its ability to adapt at the pace the environment requires. When all 7 capabilities are functioning, something emerges that isn't found in any single one of them: a nervous system. Execute is closest to the work. It senses anomalies first, the early signals that something is deviating from expected behavior. Those signals travel to Assure, which generates structured evidence from what Execute observed, turning raw operational experience into something the governance layer can act on. Govern senses drift at a different timescale, not individual anomalies, but the pattern of exceptions accumulating over weeks or months. When exceptions cluster, Govern recognizes that the intent is drifting from reality, and either the intent or the practice must change. Plan senses capacity constraints. Design captures what has been learned into usable patterns, so the next operator facing the same situation has something better to work with. Change controls the rate at which learning enters the system, sequencing updates to match absorption capacity rather than releasing them all at once. Sensing and learning are not separate boxes on an org chart. They are qualities of a healthy system, qualities that emerge when all 7 capabilities are connected and running. Here's the critical point. Without this closed loop, sensing produces data that no one acts on, and learning produces insights that land nowhere. The data gets filed, the insight gets presented in a meeting, and the next incident arrives anyway because nothing in the system actually changed. Here's a practical way to use the 7 capabilities immediately. Take one incident or major change from the recent past. Map it against 7 diagnostic questions, 1 per capability, and the systemic gaps will reveal themselves. For Govern, are decisions about settlement outcomes visible, named, and explicitly linked to specific outcomes? Or are they implicit, understood by some people, assumed by others, and never formally committed to? For Assure, is evidence generated by sampling actual settlement runs and observed behavior, or primarily by reviewing documents about how things should work? For Plan, is cutover timing anchored in fragility data, what the boundary can actually absorb, or is it driven primarily by delivery pressure and calendar commitments? For Design, do operations teams genuinely trust the reconciliation runbooks under pressure? Would they reach for them at 2 a.m, or would they improvise? For Change, are impact discussions integral to every change proposal, or do they arrive as an afterthought after the decision to proceed has already been made? For Execute, Do operators recognize settlement anomalies early and escalate safely, or does escalation feel risky? For Innovate, can the team name a recent operational experiment at this boundary and the specific lesson it produced? No consultant is required. One incident, 7 questions. The gaps will immediately reveal themselves. Here's the reframe that ties this entire session together. When the 7 capabilities are operating, when the directional core is setting and testing intent, the preparation engine is connecting constraints to usable patterns, the action engine is moving changes safely and running the system reliably, and the evolution space is adapting the system over time, something happens to the thousands of controls an organization carries. They find their natural place. Each control becomes the expression of a specific behavior at a specific boundary. Not a catalog item to be checked off, but an operational commitment that someone owns, that generates evidence, and that updates when the evidence shows it isn't working. Framework coverage, the percentage of controls mapped, the maturity scores, the compliance attestations becomes a byproduct. Not unimportant, but secondary. A consequence of a system that is genuinely working, rather than the goal the system is working toward. True governance, then, is not the maintenance of a catalog of controls. It is the operation of an engine that predictably survives stress. The controls that engine carries are evidence of its function. But the engine itself, the 7 capabilities running together, feeding each other, forcing learning at every boundary. That is what makes an organization genuinely trustable. The next session moves from the capabilities themselves to how they get expressed in the specific decisions leaders make, starting with what governance intent actually looks like when it's built to be acted on.